Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to our next session for Elements of Healthy Aging. We hope you will join us also again on July 27th when we're going to bring in the practical part of the program, which is how this all will relate to your extension program. Just remember, if you've missed any sessions or you have missed the next one, all sessions will be recorded. Next slide, please. And here is our group and also our speakers, some of our speakers today. On our team is Wendy Lynch, who has changed position, and she's now a regional specialized agent, as well as an agent based out of St. Johns County, which is St. Augustine for your non-Floridians. Also, Wendy Dahl, who is an associate professor and extension specialist of University of Florida. I'm Julie England. I'm an extension agent emeritus. I'm based actually in Central Florida. And then from our north is Julie Garden-Robinson, who's professor and food and nutrition specialist at North Dakota State University, and Carlin Racky, who is an associate professor and extension specialist at Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. Just a little bit of information. A certificate of attendance is available at the end of the Qualtrics evaluation that, of course, we know you all will fill out, whether or not you need a certificate or not. As I mentioned, all sessions are recorded, and please do complete the survey. And it's not too late to let people know, your coworkers, about our series. Even though you're probably all Zoom experts by now, please do remember, if you're putting chats in, to make sure you can decide if to send them to all panelists or to panelists and the rest of the attendees. Just got to click that little arrow. And so today is going to be the new dietary guidelines for Americans, recommendations for adults for healthy aging. And our first speaker today is Julie Garden-Robinson from North Dakota State University.
Well, hello, everyone. And I want to thank all of you for your enthusiastic response to this ongoing webinar series. And I'll have you go to the next slide. So today, what we want to do is be sure that you are knowing what the process is in creating the key messages, especially the dietary guidelines for older adults, which have been updated. We are also going to be identifying the key recommendations to improve dietary patterns of older adults, especially for chronic disease risk reduction. And then finally, our speaker will be talking about the special nutrition considerations for older adults. So next. So I will be beginning with a real brief history and a little bit of information about the process, followed by the key messages for these 2020 to 2025 guidelines, which were launched in December of 2020. So came out right during the pandemic. So I have a question for you, and I think we'll have you use the chat today. What year was the first set of dietary guidelines launched? So what year was that? They come out every 5 years. When did they start? I'm seeing 1975, 1989, 1940. Okay, I do see the right answer in that bunch. Well, it's a couple times now. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and show the answer. Actually, they came out 41 years ago, 1980. And some of you probably remember seeing some of these different graphics that were used through time, all the way from 1980 through the present. Some of you may not have been born yet in 1980. Let's go on to the next slide. So the federal data from the first edition of the Dietary Guidelines in 1980 through now have shown that we are still falling short of meeting these recommendations. That's a big unfortunately. And dietary-related chronic disease has actually risen to pervasive levels. And certainly our last year and a half have not helped in this whole process. But there's many things that we can do, and I know that many of you on this call today or on this Zoom are in the business of doing nutrition education. So we have our job cut out, but I think we can do it. So next slide. So if you haven't had a chance yet to really dig into these deeply, we're just going to be doing an overview today. You can find them most easily by just Googling or using your favorite search engine to look for 2020 to 25 dietary guidelines, or you can type in that URL. I will warn you, the PDF file is 164 pages long. And this was published, as I mentioned, in December 2020 by the USDA Center for Nutrition Policy and Promotion in conjunction with the U.S. Health and Human Services Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion. Next. So these guidelines are certainly grounded in science and also focused on public health. And why is it important to have dietary guidelines? Because they are the foundation of federal food, nutrition, and health policies and programs. These aren't guidelines that we hand out to the public necessarily. I know we have a very educated public, but they are written for all of us as health professionals and also nutrition program administrators who work with the general public. And as you all know, Choose My Plate is based on the Dietary Guidelines for Americans. So that's the more public-facing strategy to get people to, learn what they're missing in their diet. So again, these are updated every 5 years based on current science. So what are they and what are they not? These are based on foods, not nutrient requirements. So they're quantitative guidance on foods. They're not about treating disease. They're about promoting health. And they're also not intended to be clinical guidelines for treating chronic diseases such as diabetes and heart disease. So they are really meant for a more healthy public or trying to help us maintain our health. Next. So these are the 4 stages. And stage 1 is actually a new stage. And in this stage, they are identifying topics and supporting scientific questions. Next, a dietary guidelines advisory group is put together to take a look at the evidence. Third stage is to develop the dietary guidelines. And we're at the point where we can help federal government implement these dietary guidelines. Next slide. So there is a lifespan approach, and that's good. We have brand new recommendations for infants and toddlers. So that's all new. So if any of you work directly with parents, this is a great place to look for your brand new recommendations. There are expanded recommendations for people who are pregnant or breastfeeding. And we are going to be focusing on older adults, but the recommendations for children and adolescents as well as adults and those older adults that we're going to focus on have been updated. So it's a really good professional development if you haven't had a chance to click on through this on the online version. So I'm going to go through each of these individually. This is a graphic from the guidelines themselves. So I'll have you go to the next slide and we're just going to talk through these 4 steps. So follow a healthy pattern throughout at every lifespan stage. And we're looking all the way from infancy to older age. And I guess one of the key messages is that it's never too early or too late to begin eating healthfully. And I think that's a powerful message for all of us in the world of nutrition education. Next slide. This guideline, customize and enjoy nutrient-dense food and beverage choices to reflect your personal preferences, cultural traditions, and also your budget. For many years, the word enjoy was really not part of the dietary guidelines. And in other countries that also have dietary guidelines, they often use the word enjoy. So I'm really glad to see that because food is a source of great enjoyment for people as well as nutrition. Next. This guideline focus on meeting food group needs with nutrient-dense foods and beverages and stay within the calorie limits is a good one as well. What do foods do? As we all know, they provide vitamins and minerals to promote health. We don't want so many added sugars. We want to cut back on saturated fat and sodium, so very similar to the previous guidelines. And then again, we're looking at nutrient-dense forms of foods and beverages across all food groups. And a nice piece that goes right hand in hand with some of these promotional messages is that during the pandemic again, all food manufacturers now have to have nutrition labels in compliance with the FDA new nutrition label. So when we tell people, cut down on your added sugars, they can actually see added sugars on the label. Or aim for, less saturated fat. That's always been on the label, but it's right there front and center. Number 4, added sugars. These are the percents and so on. So less than 10% of calories per day. Added sugars starting at age 2. Avoid foods and beverages with added sugars for those younger than age 2. Saturated fat, less than 10% of calories per day starting at age 2. And sodium, this is a little lower than previously, less than 2,300 milligrams per day, and even less for children under age 14. And how about alcoholic beverages? Of course, we want to encourage people who are of legal drinking age to choose if they would want to drink something. And the most that's recommended is this message of moderation. 2 drinks or less in a day for men and 1 drink or less in a day for women. And certainly some adults should never drink alcohol, such as women who are pregnant. So I'm going to close out by, these are the 6 chapters, and you can read those down the line. They go all the way from infancy to older adults. And I'm going to pass this over to Carlin, and she's going to talk with us about older adults.
Okay, and Wendy, you're still in control of the slides, right? So if my audio kind of gets fuzzy, let me know, and I will turn off my video at least to see if I can improve that. So please, next slide, please. Great. So dietary patterns. So the new guidelines, as with the past versions of the guidelines, really emphasizes the importance of dietary pattern. So dietary pattern, of course, is the combination of foods and beverages that constitute the individual's complete dietary intake over time. And these foods, the reason the dietary pattern is so important is because the foods act synergistically to affect health. So rather than thinking about individual foods, it's really that complete dietary pattern that one follows that has the greatest impact on overall health. So for this reason, the dietary pattern may even better predict overall health status and disease risk than individual foods or nutrients. Consistent evidence demonstrates that a healthy diet pattern is associated with beneficial outcomes for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, overweight and obesity, type 2 diabetes, bone health, and certain types of cancers. For this reason, the dietary guidelines have identified common characteristics of a healthy diet pattern, and they describe these in various distinct examples in past guidelines as well as in the current guidelines. Next. So healthy dietary patterns can take on many forms depending on the preferences of the individuals. And the guidelines dietary patterns approach enables those using the guidelines to help people personalize their food and beverage choices to accommodate their food preferences, cultural traditions and customs, and budgetary considerations. So some common elements of a healthy pattern include that they are abundant in a variety of fruits and vegetables. They emphasize whole grains and include a variety of foods high in protein that should include legumes, nuts and seeds, seafood, meat, poultry, and eggs. Most of the healthy dietary patterns are low in full fat milk or dairy products, but some have substantial amounts of low fat milk and milk products. Healthy diet patterns also include less added diet and have an overall high unsaturated to saturated fat ratio in their diets. Next. So achieving a healthy diet pattern at each life stage, so we talked about these dietary guidelines actually is really a life stage kind of way of looking at healthy diets. And so establishing a healthy diet pattern at each life stage, it not only supports the health at that particular point in time, but it also supports health in the next life stage and possibly future generations. If healthy dietary patterns can be established early, significant. Next. So I'm seeing all the stuff coming through the chat box. I'm glad you guys are conversing about this. So right, it's poll time again, and I think we're just going to have you again pop your answer into the chat. So for the current dietary guidelines, we want to see how many of you guys know how they are classified, the older adult category start for these particular guidelines. 60 and older, 65 and older, or 70 and older. You guys are so good. Yeah. Very, very right. It is 60 and over. So let's move on to the next slide. So the overarching theme of the 2020 DGAs is to follow a healthy dietary pattern at every stage of life, and that it's never too late to make improvements in the diet that can have positive health impacts. As mentioned previously, the DGAs translate the current science on diet and health into guidance to help people choose a healthy and enjoyable diet pattern. The guidelines have primarily a public health mission, as Julie mentioned. That is, it is to promote health and disease prevention, not really one of treatment or clinical guidance. Having said that, at least one chronic health condition, and 60% have at least 2 chronic health conditions, according to the CDC. Although the dietary guidelines promote health and prevent chronic disease, the scientific evidence reviewed to inform the guidelines included a representative sample of the US population that included healthy individuals, but also those that were at risk or were living with chronic disease, cholesterol, prediabetes, overweight, and obesity. The evidence shows that they would benefit from following the dietary guideline recommendations to prevent progression of disease, such as cardiovascular disease. So the dietary guidelines certainly are relevant to older adults, even if they have a current chronic disease condition. The guidelines also form the foundation for health professionals that can modify the guidelines to address specific chronic disease, so the health professionals. Next. Oh, are you guys hearing some bad sounds? Let me see. I hope the sound is okay. I'm seeing some comment that the sound's bad, but okay. So here, this is a graphic that shows an estimate of the percentage of people from each age group that are adhering to the recommendations of the dietary guidelines, and it starts with people of age 2 to 4. This is estimated using what is called the Healthy Eating Index. So the Healthy Eating Index is a measure of diet quality used to assess how well a set of foods aligns with the key recommendations of the DGAs. You guys are, is that noise? I noticed from the chat that there's a noise. If you guys want me to, I can see if I can change to, I think it's my computer fan. It would take a few minutes. Don't know if I should do that or not.
I think you need to keep going, Carlin.
So Wendy, should I just keep going? Okay, I'm sorry, guys. Turn off your video. Okay, let me turn off my video and see. I don't think that's going to help. I think it's my fan, but. Okay, so let's keep going. So we were talking about the Healthy Eating Index, okay? So it was originally how well Americans are following the dietary guidelines. It's been updated twice since 2005. And the most current version measures how diets conform to the 2015 to 2020 dietary guidelines. So the last version of the guidelines. The HEI uses a scoring system to evaluate a set of foods, and the scores range from 0 to 100. An ideal overall HEI score of 100 reflects that the set of foods aligns really well with the key dietary guidelines from the DGAs. The overall HEI 2015 score is made up of 13 components that reflect the different food groups and our key recommendations in the 2015 DGAs. So you can see from this graphic that all of the age groups have room for improvement in terms of their compliance with the DGAs, and that the age groups at the beginning and at the end have the highest scores, with older adults having the highest score of adherence to everybody. So next slide. So a recent systematic review of studies that looked at the association of the HEI and 2 other diet quality indexes to multiple health outcomes, including all-cause mortality and cancer mortality in cancer survivors, had some interesting results. So the results showed that the highest scores in the 3 indexes showed significant risk reduction for all-cause mortality, so a 22% lower risk reduction for cancer for all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease incidence and mortality, a 22% risk reduction, cancer incidence and mortality, 16% reduction, type 2 diabetes with an 18% risk reduction, and neurodegenerative diseases. So having a higher HEI score really is associated with improved risk reduction for chronic disease. Among cancer survivors, diets with the highest quality index scores resulted in a 12% risk reduction of all-cause mortality and 10% risk reduction in cancer mortality. So the score really has some significance. There's good evidence that the closer the dietary pattern of older adults conforms with the dietary guidelines, the lower the risk for chronic disease and mortality from those diseases. Next slide. So the new DGAs provide us with a closer look at the dietary pattern of older adults 60 and older. So this graphic illustrates the recommended intake ranges for this age group for the 5 major food groups: vegetables, fruits, grains, dairy, and protein foods. So the green bubbles are the recommended ranges for each food group by sex, and the purple dots are the average daily food group intake of adults age 60 and older for each sex. The intake data is from the NHANES data of 2015-2016. So this first, you can see from this first arrow that the data indicates that, similar to other groups, adults 60 years and older are on average under consuming fruits and vegetables. Next slide. Average daily intake of grains is within the recommended range for men and very close to it for women. But daily intake of dairy, which is an important source for calcium, vitamin D, and bone health, is well below the recommendation. And finally, average intake from the protein food group, which was discussed in an earlier webinar in this series, is within the recommended daily intake for men and slightly below for women. The adequacy of daily intake of protein foods should take into consideration the growing body of evidence that the daily protein needs of older adults actually may be higher than the current recommendation. So just that one caution with that outcome. Next. So the DGAs dig a little bit deeper into the adequacy of intake from the various food groups. And so by looking at the subgroup recommendations, we can get kind of hone in on where in the vegetable group are they deficient, et cetera. So as mentioned, eating a variety of foods within each food group is important because of the unique nutrients that they provide and their unique associations with improved health and disease. Next slide. In looking at this, at the subgroup of the vegetables, we see that average weekly intakes are below those recommended in the guidelines for dark green vegetables. And the recommendation for somebody on a 2,000 calorie diet for dark green vegetables is 1.5 equivalents per week. Red and orange vegetables are quite below what would be recommended, which is 5 cup equivalents per week. They're also below the 1.5 cup recommendation for beans, peas, and lentils, and the 5 cup equivalent recommendation per week for starchy vegetables. So basically, the older adults are low in vegetable consumption in almost all of the subgroups. Next slide. So the grain group also has a subgroup recommendations that relate to the consumption of whole grains. And we know that although in looking at this graphic, although the average intake of total grains is within the recommendation for older adults, there is an imbalance in the type of grains being chosen. And this, of course, is very common actually throughout all of the age groups. Older adult, like most of these age groups, need to increase the amount of whole grains they're consuming. Next. And then one more time. So finally, as mentioned earlier, the average daily intake of protein foods of adults age 60 and older is within the recommendation, but, next slide, the average weekly consumption of seafood is below the recommendation. So encouraging older adults to include more seafood in their diets on a weekly basis is a very appropriate recommendation. Next. So choosing nutrient-dense foods that are low in added sugar and fat becomes more important with aging as the level of activity, muscle mass, and caloric needs declines. In addition, prevalence and risk of cardiovascular disease increases with age. Dietary patterns that are low in saturated fat and sodium are important for this age group. You can see from this graphic that over half of older adults are exceeding the recommended limits in added sugars. About 80% are consuming more than the 10% of their calories in saturated fat, and 70% of women and over 90% of men are exceeding the recommendation of 2,300 milligrams of sodium daily. The prevalence of sweet and salty foods in the diets of people actually tends to increase with aging, and there's some evidence that loss of taste and olfactory function may play a role in this, although a direct connection with this has not been established. The reality is that food choices are based on a complex interaction of physical and social factors, access and economics, as well as, of course, the all-important food preference that need to be taken into consideration when we are working with older adults to get them to modify their diets to more closely align with the dietary guidelines. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Wendy.
Thank you, Carlin. Let's see if I can manage both. All right, so we're going to move into the special considerations for adults 60 and older. And for adults 60 and older, we know that they're typically going to have a lower calorie need in comparison to younger adults, and it's typically lower for females than males. And we know that nutrient-dense foods and beverages, choosing those types of foods and beverages is essential. Underconsumed nutrients and dietary components or nutrients of public health concern across all ages, which includes adults 60 and older, is calcium, potassium, dietary fiber, as well as vitamin D. But in addition to those nutrients, we also want to include specific for adults 60 and older is protein, vitamin B12, and beverages. And so hopefully you were able to join us for session 1 in Dr. Nordstrom Stadsny's presentation on greater protein intakes are associated with improved body composition. If not, there is a link. It should be live on your PDF. But she reviewed the importance of protein in building and maintaining muscle strength and its potential impacts on activities of daily living. And as shared on a previous slide, the Dietary Guidelines report that most older adults are consuming enough protein from the subgroups meats, poultry, and eggs, as Carlin mentioned, but are falling short in that seafood area. Also, average intake is lower for adults that are 71 and older as compared to adults 60 to 70. Now, if an individual is consuming adequate total protein, it is recommended to add some variety by the Dietary Guidelines. So making sure you're getting each of the subgroups, specifically seafood. And for ages 60 and older, the current RDA for protein is between 10 to 35% of daily calories. But remember, Dr. Stasny, she suggested in session 1 that the current RDA is not optimal for muscle health while aging. So moving on to vitamin B12, and we know that vitamin B12, it functions for red blood cell development, DNA synthesis, as well as playing a role in the functioning of the CNS or central nervous system. And the RDA is 2.4 micrograms for both men and women ages 60 and older. And vitamin B12 deficiency can often take several years to show symptoms because our bodies do store a bit of that 1 to 5 micrograms. So what does that mean? What does it look like? Why are we concerned about vitamin B12 deficiency? Well, we know that deficiency can be caused by a variety of reasons. It could be decreased ability to absorb the vitamin from foods. It could be use of certain medications such as metformin or a proton pump inhibitor. And NIH has a great supplemental publication on vitamin B12. I encourage you to check it out. Another cause of deficiency is GI surgery. And in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, in that scientific report, it also links vitamin B12 and cognitive function. And the National Institute of Health states that vitamin B12 deficiency can not only impact blood cell count, it can cause fatigue, dementia, weight loss, and infertility, as well as neurological changes. And in our dietary guidelines, they do recommend trying to get the B12 through our protein foods, fortified, and dietary supplements. Of course, advised by your healthcare provider. But let's think about common sources of our protein, our vitamin B12. But the first would be protein, that animal products such as meat, some seafood and fish, poultry, eggs, and dairy. Another option is fortified foods such as fortified nutritional yeast, fortified breakfast cereals. And we know that fortified foods as well as supplements are in that free form of B12. So if you have difficulty or if a participant has difficulty with absorption, those would be good sources because they are able to absorb those, with the exception of individuals with pernicious anemia. And then supplements, I know Dr. Whiting shared that compared to food alone, and this is her direct quote, multivitamin was associated with a higher nutrient intake and a lower prevalence of inadequacies, and improved nutrient biomarker status of B12. And if you missed that session, again, that was session 2. So in this study by E8 Bullitt et al., it evaluated the relationship between B12 deficiency and sarcopenia in older adults. And going back to session 1, they defined dynapenia and sarcopenia. So dynapenia is loss of muscle strength and for that power. Sarcopenia is age-related loss of muscle mass. And vitamin B12 deficiency might be related to development of both dynapenia and sarcopenia in older adults. So take a look at the figure. When vitamin B12 status is greater than that 400 picograms per milliliters, the incidence of sarcopenia and dynapenia is less frequent. Of course, we all know the importance of beverages, specifically water intake. We know it's key for hydration as well as absorption of food and nutrients. If we're providing or encouraging our clients to consume beverages, we are going to encourage them to choose water first, or unsweetened beverages, 100% fruit or vegetable juices, as well as low or fat-free milk or fortified soy beverages, because you know you're getting that protein with the soy beverages. And according to the dietary guideline, current intake is about 2 cups fewer than adults, for older adults, than the adults ages 59 and younger. And some of the reasons or causes that could be behind this is either the thirst sensation declines, as well as bladder related concerns. And I thought this was really interesting by Pross. A 1 to 2% water loss increases confusion, fatigue, stress, and even depression. So in this study by Mentanzas et al., they looked at cognitive changes in individuals, both hydrated and dehydrated over a period of time. And the more time that passes for an individual who was dehydrated, you can see in the figure there that cognitive ability declines so much more so than the hydrated individuals. And I know Julie touched on alcoholic beverages, but we know that when you look at those calorie or the dietary patterns that you see in the back of the dietary guidelines and then mentioned all throughout the document, you see that they're not included in that total calorie. They're not making up a healthy dietary pattern. Those calories are not included. Julie mentioned about the limiting intake, 1 drink or less per day for women, 2 for men. And this applies for older adults as well. And depending upon the amount of alcohol consumed, it can impact mortality rate. Another thing, it says that, with depending on alcohol consumed, sugar intake may also be increased depending upon the alcohol of choice. And when dietary guidelines suggest that when added sugars exceed that 10% of intake, a healthy dietary pattern is truly difficult to achieve. If you're following and meeting all the different food groups and subgroups, there's very little wiggle room with those few extra calories. Page 42 in the dietary guidelines does give you an example of a 2,000 calorie diet with a 7% available for extras, which I thought was a great example to use with clients. Another thing to be concerned with is the effects of alcohol may impact older adults faster, and it also increases risk for falls and accidents as well as injury. And I'm going to jump to the next slide and share this study. You can see here, it shows an association between lifetime alcohol consumption and risk of death. And they have the occasional drinker, light drinker, moderate drinker versus the heavy binge drinker. And I've highlighted the heavy binge drinker because they obviously are going to have that higher risk of death. No association was found among occasional drinkers, and no association between beverage preference. So depending upon what they wanted to drink. So we know, again, going back to encouraging more water intake. And today we covered a lot in a short period of time. We looked at the history and process of the dietary guidelines, as well as some of the key messaging and dietary patterns, the healthy eating index, and specific needs or unique needs for adults 60 and older. And with that, I'm going to open the floor for questions.